Today's video is brought to you by Babbel, the #1 language app in the world with more than 10 million subscribers worldwide. The world is getting smaller and smaller, and your list of reasons for learning another language is getting bigger and bigger. So whether your language needs are tied to international travel, professional necessity, or just personal curiosity, there's no better option than Babbel. Now, you might have had a crack at this already with some basic free apps from the App Store, but Babbel goes way beyond the basics with 14 languages and proven learning techniques. So why is Babbel better? Well, with Babbel, you can count on people who have actual experience teaching the language rather than just relying on machine learning like other apps do. It's also totally ad-free, which means it's distraction-free. That way you can just focus on the learning. It'll also focus on language for real life, teaching you about situations you'll actually encounter. Less biblioteca and more vino, if you know what I mean. And if you don't, well, you should get Babbel. And with Babbel, it's really easy to just jump in and practice whenever you have a down moment, and those short few minutes of practice, they all do add up. Start learning a new language today with Babbel, and for a limited time, you can get up to 65% off the cost of a subscription. There's a link below. Was there ever such a thing as a good pirate? Sure, they might be popular today, but there's no denying in their own time they were responsible for a lot of hardship and sorrow. The freedom, the danger, and the careless life on the open sea might have romanticized pirates in our minds, but they were still ruthless criminals who, at their best, robbed victims and, at their worst, tortured, raped, and murdered them. There was a certain level of violence that was to be expected as a pirate, especially if you wanted to climb through the ranks. But what happened when a captain really wanted to avoid violence as much as possible? And when he got into trouble with his own men because they thought he was too soft on their victims. This is the story of Edward England, a pirate captain who tried to spare the lives of his fiercest enemies and was marooned by his own men for his efforts. We have to start off with a quick note that we often include in our pirate biographies, one that we like to call the Johnson disclaimer. As with many of his compatriots, the main contemporary source for the life of Edward England is the book A General History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson, whose accuracy leaves something to be desired. Not even the identity of the author is truly known, since Charles Johnson was a pseudonym for one or even multiple writers. With that in mind, there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding the early life of Edward England, since he does not really appear in the historical record until he became a sailor. We are almost certain that England was not his real name, and some sources claim that it was Seager, and he most likely adopted a pseudonym when he raised the black flag and became a pirate. As far as his date of birth is concerned, we know his approximate age when he died, so we can work backwards and estimate that Edward England was born around 1685, and he was born in Ireland despite his adopted surname. In November 1700, King Charles II of Spain died without an heir, causing a power struggle for the throne of the powerful Spanish Empire. A few months later, this triggered the War of Spanish Succession, as one side wanted Philip of Anjou, part of the Royal French House of Bourbon, to become the new king, while the other side feared that a strong alliance between France and Spain would have made them too powerful, so they wanted the two kingdoms to remain separate. England was in the second camp, and since maritime supremacy was something that all the European powers coveted, there was always a need for new sailors to take to the seas. That is presumably how a young Edward England started his nautical career, although we do not know any specifics about his service. The War of Spanish Succession ended in 1714, and as always in such situations, this created a new wave of pirates. Up until that point, many sailors attacked and plundered other ships legally as privateers, as long as they only targeted enemy ships and sent their part of the profits back to England. Once the war was over, however, they were no longer allowed to do that, but at the same time, many of them did not know or want to do anything else, so they saw no other choice but to turn to piracy. Edward England was not one of these men, surprisingly. After the war, it seems that he found legitimate employment as a mate aboard a merchant sloop sailing out of Jamaica. However, during one voyage, the ship was attacked by a pirate vessel captained by a man named Christopher Winter, who forced England to join his crew. Winter then sailed back to Nassau on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. At the time, Nassau served as a haven and a base of operations for many pirates active in the Caribbean, and many notorious captains of that time stopped at Nassau around the same time to trade and resupply. They included Benjamin Hornigold, Henry Jennings, Charles Vane, Blackbeard, Calico, Jack Rackham, and many others. They even became known informally as the Flying Gang, and Edward England joined their ranks. England's might have been reluctant to become a pirate, but ultimately he accepted this new life. Captain Johnson described England as one of these men who seemed to have such a share of reason as should have taught him better things. He had a great deal of good nature and did not want for courage. He was not avaricious and always averse to the ill usage prisoners received. He would have been contented with moderate plunder and less mischievous pranks could his companions have been brought to the same temper, but he was generally overruled, and as he was engaged in that abominable society, he was obliged to be a partner in all their vile actions. It is unknown how long England sailed under Captain Winter, but it was probably only for a few months. By 1716, he was part of Henry Jennings's crew, fighting to recover the Spanish treasure that sank off the coast of Florida. The 1715 treasure fleet is a legendary chapter in nautical lore, one that directly spurred on the so-called golden age of piracy that followed Spanish succession. On July the 24th, 1715, a fleet of 12 Spanish ships left Havana, heading back home to Spain. They were all filled to the brim with treasure, particularly gold coins and silver. 7 days later, on July the 31st, the treasure fleet encountered a hurricane off the central coast of Florida. As the powerful winds and waves battered the ship to pieces, only one managed to escape. The other 11 sank to the bottom of the sea, taking over 1,000 sailors to their watery graves, as well as one of the greatest treasures in the world. Unsurprisingly, the temptation was too great for people to simply sit idly by and let the Spanish recover their gold. Like many of his ilk, Henry Jennings had been a privateer, but now that the war was over, his status was a bit murky. He had been based out of Jamaica, a British possession at the time, operating with the permission of the governor, Lord Archibald Hamilton. When news reached him of the sunken fleet, he boarded a ship, the Beersheba, and sailed to Florida, raiding the coastal villages that recovered part of the treasure that washed ashore. Of course, this was only the beginning, as the Beersheba and other vessels intended to salvage the entire fleet, but this was not something Spain would simply allow. This wasn't a single privateer committing a random attack on a merchant ship, an isolated incident that would have been overlooked even in peacetime. Since a treaty had been signed between the two countries, Spain demanded that the English ships end their salvaging attempts immediately. Some of them did. For others, however, the allure of Spanish gold was just too good to pass up, so they abandoned the English flag and became pirates. That was the case with Henry Jennings, who then had to leave Jamaica and settle in Nassau. He was soon joined by other pirates such as Benjamin Hornigold, Edward Teach, Charles Vane, and of course Edward England, all of whom intended to use the island of New Providence as their headquarters while they conducted raids in the waters off the coast of Florida. This led to a few years of intense pirate activity in the Caribbean, until eventually the British Crown decided that enough was enough and appointed Captain Woodes Rogers as the first governor of the Bahamas in 1717, giving him the task of suppressing piracy in the region. To accomplish this, Rogers knew that he had to take Nassau. He arrived there in 1718 with a fleet, and barring one skirmish with Charles Vane, he managed to assume control of the port city without much incident. Rogers also came with an offer of peace. King George I of Britain had issued a royal decree which became known as the King's Pardon. It was a one-time deal. Any pirate who wanted to renounce their old ways could accept the King's pardon and receive complete amnesty for whatever they had done. Those who refused the offer, or who reneged on the deal, would be hunted down and executed. With Nassau in British hands, hundreds of pirates accepted the pardon. This included Henry Jennings, who retired a wealthy man on a plantation, and Benjamin Hornigold, who became a pirate hunter and fought his former compatriots. Others, such as Charles Vane and Jack Rackham, had no interest in any other life but that of a pirate, so they continued as they were until their inevitable doom at the end of a noose. Curiously, Edward England did not take the pardon, even though it could have been his one chance to resume his old life. By 1718, he was a captain of his own ship, which he named the Fancy in honour of Henry Every, and even though he had been reluctant to become a pirate, it seems that now he had little desire to go back. When Bahamas became too dangerous for the likes of him, England and his crew sailed the coasts of Africa. Once he reached Africa, it seemed like England's piratical career began in earnest. He started taking prizes, by which we mean attacking and plundering other ships, and the first of which, we are well informed, was a snow ship sailing out of Bristol called Cadogan. According to Charles Johnson, this ship was commanded by a man named Skinner, who used to be the captain for several of the pirate crewmen back when they still sailed under the British Crown. Apparently, the men were not happy with how Skinner had treated them, so they took this opportunity to have their revenge on him. They tied the captain up and pelted him with empty bottles. When they had their fun, they shot him in the head. Curiously, the ship's mate, a man named Hal Davis, was unperturbed by the pirates' actions and wanted to join their ranks. He took command of the Cadogan and sailed for South America, starting his own successful stint as a pirate captain. As far as Edward England was concerned, 1719 was probably his most successful year, as he captured well over a dozen prizes with little effort and few losses. This included a ship called the Pearl under the command of Captain Tizard, which England kept for himself, renamed the Royal James, and made his new flagship. Of the other prizes taken by England and his crew, some were added to his fleet, some were let go, and others were burned. Besides their numerous encounters with other ships, England and his crew also had a violent fight with the locals in a port town where they docked for a few weeks to resupply and make repairs on their ships. As Charles Johnson very delicately put it, the pirates were making free with the town women, which eventually angered the local men enough to start a fight with England's crew. Unfortunately for the residents, the pirates won, and not only did they kill a bunch of locals, but they also set the town on fire on their way out. Afterwards, the pirates held a vote on where they should go next, and they settled on the East Indies, so Edward England left the coast of southern Africa and headed for the Indian Ocean. They arrived at Madagascar at the beginning of 1720. They used the island as a headquarters while they targeted mainly Indian and Dutch merchant ships. Most of England's targets were easy pickings, but that changed when he ran into Captain James Macrae of the Cassandra. The Cassandra was a British ship that was prepared for a fight and unwilling to simply capitulate to pirates. Fortunately for us, we have a first-hand account of the violent events that unfolded, courtesy of Captain Macrae himself, who provided the details in a letter dated Bombay, November 16th, 1720. Since it's quite long, here's an abridged version with all the juicy bits. We arrived the 25th of July last in company of the Greenwich at Joanna. We found 14 pirates that came in their canoes from the Mayotta, Captain Kirby and I concluding it might be of great service to the East India Company to destroy such a nest of rogues. Were ready to sail for that purpose on the 17th of August, about 8 o'clock in the morning, when we discovered two pirate ships standing in the Bay of Juana, one of 34 and the other of 30 guns. I immediately went on board the Greenwich, where they seemed very diligent in preparations for an engagement, and I left Captain Kirby with mutual promises of standing by each other. I called several times the Greenwich to bear down to our assistance, and Ferd shot at him, but to no purpose, because when he got about a league from us, he deserted us and left us engaged with barbarous and inhuman enemies with their black and bloody flags hanging over us. We engaged them both about 3 hours, during which the biggest received some shot betwixt wind and water, which made her keep off a little to stop her leaks. The other endeavoured as she could to board us by rowing with her oars, being within half a ship's length of us above an hour, but by good fortune we shot all her oars to pieces, which prevented them and by consequence saved our lives. About 4 o'clock, most of the officers and men posted on the quarter deck being killed and wounded, we endeavoured to run ashore. Here we had a more violent engagement than before. All my officers and most of my men behaved with unexpected courage, and as we had a considerable advantage by having a broadside to his bow, we did him great damage, but the other pirate supplied his consort with 3 boats full of fresh men. About 5 in the evening, the Greenwich stood clear away to sea, leaving us struggling hard for life in the very jaws of death, which the other pirate that was afloat, seeing, got a warp out and was hauling under our stern, by which time many of my men being killed and wounded and no hopes left us from being all murdered by enraged barbarous conquerors, I ordered all that could to get into the longboat under the cover of the smoke of our guns, so that with what some did in boats and others by swimming, most of us that were able got ashore by 7 o'clock. When the pirates came aboard, they cut 3 of our wounded men to pieces. I, with a few of my people, made what haste I could to the King's Town, 25 miles from us, where I arrived next day, almost dead with fatigue and loss of blood, having been sorely wounded in the head by a musket ball. Edward England had won the engagement, as his enemies fled into the jungle. However, it came with a heavy price, as England had lost around 90 crewmen in the fight, and one of his 2 ships, the Fancy, had been damaged almost beyond repair. The Royal James had also taken a battering, and now the pirates would have to spend a few weeks on the island in order to make it seaworthy again. Unsurprisingly, the heavy losses led to strong resentment among the bloodthirsty pirates, particularly towards the remaining crew of the Cassandra, who were hiding out somewhere in the nearby jungle. But the survivors had no way of leaving the island, so with little choice left, Captain McCrae contacted the pirates and travelled aboard the Royal James to surrender and hope for mercy. This was when the crew started to turn against England, because they felt he was too forgiving for a pirate. He indeed wanted to show the survivors of the Cassandra mercy, but he was also aware that he was heavily in the minority, as most of his crew wanted to cut McCrae and his men to pieces. Therefore, he told McCrae that he needed to convince his second-in-command, John Taylor, captain of the heavily damaged Fancy. This was easier said than done, because Taylor, described as a fellow of most barbarous nature, was nowhere near as compassionate as England. Therefore, McCrae decided to forego appealing to his humanity and tried a different tactic: plying him with alcohol. This strategy worked. Taylor got wasted enough that he consented to give McCrae his former ship and a few bales of cloth before passing out in drunken stupor. Pirates sailed away on September 3rd aboard the Royal James and the Cassandra. Meanwhile, McCrae and 43 of his men, who survived the fight, spent another week on the island performing repairs on the Fancy in order to make it as seaworthy as possible. But despite their hardships, now came the most difficult part of all, as McCrae and his crew had to sail to India through treacherous seas aboard a damaged vessel with very little food and water. The captain described his ordeal: "After a passage of 48 days, I arrived here October the 22nd, almost naked and starved, having been reduced to a pint of water a day, and almost in despair of ever seeing land by reason of the calms we met with between the coasts of Arabia and Malabar. We had in all 13 men killed and 24 wounded." It's a bit unclear what happened to McCrae immediately following his arrival in Bombay. Word reached the pirates that the former captain of the Cassandra had been given a commission to hunt them down and had already secured a new ship and crew and was in pursuit. Whether or not this was true is the uncertain part, but just the threat of it sealed the fate of Edward England. Most of his crew were already angry with him due to his gentle demeanour unbefitting a pirate captain in their minds, and John Taylor already has his sights set on the captaincy, so they mutinied against England and Taylor assumed command of the ship. As for the former captain, his punishment was marooning. England was abandoned on a desert island with only a few days' worth of food and water. It's unclear if he was also given a pistol with just one bullet to spare himself a slow, agonising death, or if this was an invention of Hollywood. Either way, he was not alone, as 3 crewmen stood by their captain, and they were also left behind. Normally, marooning meant certain death, either through dehydration, starvation, or drowning when they tried to escape the island. But there are a handful of cases where the victims survived, the most famous being that of Alexander Selkirk, the man who inspired Robinson Crusoe. In the case of Edward England, his good fortune was the island where he was marooned. Back then, it was a French possession known as Isle de France, though today we'd call it Mauritius. The French had claimed it around 1715, after the Dutch had abandoned it, but they were yet to colonize it, so it was truly deserted. But there was plenty to hunt on the island, so the 4 marooned men did not suffer for a lack of food, and thanks to the Dutch, they found themselves some abandoned structures which they recycled for building materials. After a few months on the island, they had managed to make themselves a little boat that they used to sail to St. Augustine's Bay in Madagascar. If this was a fictional story, this would probably be just the beginning of the 3rd act, when Edward England would secure a new ship and a new crew and sail out to get revenge on the people who marooned him. But the truth is that the ordeal took a great toll on him, and England arrived in Madagascar in very poor health, not to mention that he didn't have a single penny to his name. He was reduced to begging and relying on the charity of other pirates who once knew him. Charles Johnson does not mention Edward England's ultimate fate, although other sources claim that he died shortly after in 1721, purportedly of some tropical disease. It was an ignoble death, one ill-befitting a man whose main perceived flaw was that he was too compassionate for his own good. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Babbel, as well. Link below. And thank you for watching.